Welcome, everyone. We'll give it a minute to let people in from the waiting room. Glad you can all join us this afternoon. Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming in. We'll give it one more minute for everyone to come in from the waiting room. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat in the meantime. And I think we have captioning enabled now. Yep, we have captioning on. So feel free to get that started. I see a few people raising their hands. We'll have a chance for Q&A where we can have people come off mute a little bit later on in the program. But for now, welcome you to contribute in the chat or type in the Q&A box. All right, I have 2:32. Seems like the waiting room is slowing down. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC, and I'm really excited to welcome you all to the fourth webinar in the Our Homes, Our Votes webinar series with a little help from our friends. And I'm really excited to have some of our friends here today from the voter engagement and economic justice advocacy community. We have Maggie Bush, who's the Programs and Outreach Director at the League of Women Voters. And we have Joseph Battistelli, the Director of Outreach and Membership for the Coalition on Human Needs. Joseph is filling in last minute for Dominique Espinosa, who's also here. Dominique is a little bit under the weather, but we'll still chime in the chat. So we really appreciate you being here as well, Dominique. And so just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. We will send out the slides and the recording and all of the resources to everyone who's registered. So look out for that in your inbox in the next few days. It'll also be posted online. And please use the Q&A box to ask questions. We'll have plenty of time for questions for our panelists later on. And with that, I will pass it over to Maggie to get us started.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I've spoken with your coalition and advocates within your umbrella group across the country and several times over the last many election years, but I'm really thrilled to be here today. As Courtney said, I'm the Programs and Outreach Director for the national headquarters of the League of Women Voters. I expect some folks on the call today may be familiar with us. I'm going to give you a quick kind of overview of what we do, specifically what the current landscape is in regards to voting rights right now, going into the general election season for the midterm year. Lots of you are having state primaries tomorrow, in fact, and over the next few weeks as well. So kind of what we're really keeping an eye on in terms of voting rights, and then really hope to spend most of my time talking about what you all can do as advocates and how organizations like the League can help you do that so you don't have to start from scratch. So if you're not familiar with the League of Women Voters, we have some historical images here on the next slide. We were founded out of the women's suffrage movement. So suffragists founded our organization 102 years ago, when it became clear that women were finally going to gain the right to vote in our country. It was finally going to happen, and there were millions of women who needed basic information about how to participate in elections. So that is really how we were founded. Of course, the 19th Amendment extended voting rights to white women primarily, and certainly other groups of women, including Black women, were left out of having the constitutional right to vote until later on during the civil rights movement. And still today, many communities, especially women, are disproportionately impacted by the voting rights struggles that we have. So I want to include that important caveat, but just to say that today, a lot of our work looks similar to how it looked 100 years ago, in that we provide nonpartisan education around voting and elections, who's on the ballot, how voting is working, how to get registered and turned out to vote. And then we work with thousands of partners on the ground, including many of your local organizations, to help encourage voter turnout and provide that basic information. And towards the end, I'll share more information about how to connect with your local League of Women Voters chapter if you don't have a relationship already. So just a little bit more about kind of what we are and who we are. Well, I already covered this part. It's important to know we never support or oppose candidates for political office. So everything I'll be talking about today in terms of voter education is nonpartisan. On the 501c4 side, our advocacy arm, we do a lot of advocacy work and legislative work, litigation on voting rights. I'm going to talk about a little of that, but everything I'm going to share in terms of best practices is safely nonpartisan. I know Joseph is also going to touch on that when he speaks, and kind of how to make sure you're keeping your activities safe for nonpartisan kind of behavior. We are active, just so you know, in 750 communities. So it's very likely that there is a League of Women Voters affiliate in your community. And we have over 500,000 people kind of contributing to our work through on the ground volunteer opportunities, through online action, and through traditional membership as well across the country. So in terms of the fight for voting rights, and I'm on slide 7, Kayla. Next one, sorry, skipped ahead of you. I don't think I need to tell this group. I'm sure you all know voting rights, along with many of the other issues that we care about, has been at the forefront of work, not only at the congressional level this year and in the last 2 years since the 2020 election, but certainly in our state houses and state courtrooms around the country. So following the 2020 election, there were over 400 anti-voter bills introduced in states across the country. These bills disproportionately target Black, Brown, and women voters in different ways. I'm going to talk about how they do that in a minute. Certainly not all of these have gone into effect, but it's clear that it's been a full-time struggle fighting back against these, trying to protect impacted voters, and most importantly, trying to make sure that impacted voters understand what their rights are and how they can still access their right to vote. I think that's the role that we all can play. Even if your state is facing worse voting conditions or more discriminatory voting conditions than it has in the past, and that unfortunately is the case for many of us, there is still a whole lot we can do to help empower the people that we interact with. So we are working to stop this on all fronts, and I'm always happy to answer questions about what we're doing there. On the next slide, again, I don't think I probably need to underscore the importance of why this matters, but if people aren't able to vote and are disproportionately impacted and kept away from their right to vote, like many of the underrepresented communities that we serve and that you serve, we know that it does many things, right? It prolongs our white supremacist infrastructure in this country. It prolongs our legacy of unequal barriers to the vote, which of course leaves out communities from having a say and in electing representatives who represent their needs. It especially dilutes our voices on things like reproductive rights, climate, immigration, policing, all of which are, of course, at the forefront of voters' minds going into these elections. And it, of course, harms our communities in long-term ways by limiting our representation. We know, for example, that the Census Bureau has already said that they are certain that Black voters, Black citizens, and non-citizens alike were undercounted in the census last year, which is a little separate from voting, but we've right there already seen long-term lack of representation that will compound voting, as do these voter suppression tactics, and it will impact not just the next decade, the next election cycle, but many to come. Certainly a few of the trends that I wanted to talk about that specifically impact folks who live in affordable housing, folks who, make up possibly your client base or those you serve or the partner groups that you work with. Reduction of early voting hours has happened in many states. That may be the case in your state. I encourage you to make sure if you're going out and doing voter outreach, it's important to either know this information or at least know where you can point people. And so the League is one group you can always point people to. And I'll talk about that in a minute, or other civic groups that you work with in your community. Limited, absentee, and vote by mail. So this is particularly of note because during the 2020 election, because of COVID, many states made absentee and mail voting a lot easier. They lifted a lot of the restrictions. Many folks are going into now the 2022 elections, assuming they'll have the same options that they did in 2020. That is not always the case. In my state of Virginia, it's already been made a little more challenging. In other states, it's been made significantly more challenging, like in Texas. If anyone's from Texas, I'm sure we have some folks on the call today. The changes to vote by mail have already had a huge and demonstrable impact during the primary election in Texas back in March, and we know it will increasingly impact voters' rights going into the general election. We also know that polling place locations and long lines, again, specifically impact disproportionately Black and Brown voters and those on a limited income. Those also have been in flux and all over the place as a result of COVID, and will continue to play out this year. So again, things to be aware of: redistricting, which happened. I mentioned the census. The redistricting process has unfolded in all of your states following the results of the 2020 census, and so there are new polling places. There are new districts in every state across the country. This will impact where some people vote, which district they're voting in, who they see on their ballot. So another thing to be aware of. Some of your states are still fighting over their redistricting maps. And so we've even seen primary election dates have to move and cause additional confusion on top of that, right? For some voters in some of your states. So again, those are, that's key to be kind of aware of. Limiting the number of poll workers. I'm sure people are aware that poll workers are under threat in our country, and election officials. There was a recent poll that more than 80% of elections officials felt threatened in doing their work, and we're even considering, and a large percentage were considering leaving that job, stopping doing that work because of the personal threats and political kind of attack that has been in place for several years now, and especially was exacerbated in 2020. So if we're limiting the number of poll workers and election officials, that again can have a disproportionate impact on the voters that we serve. All the more reason why it's also important to sign up as a poll worker if you're available to do that. And we can talk about that too in a minute. And then finally, voter ID requirements, of course, disproportionately impact women voters, voters in communities of color. There are millions of people in this country who don't have a valid photo ID at their current, with their current address listed, and that can impact their right to vote. And so certainly that would impact many of your folks. And so helping people get ID if they need it in order to vote can be a key way that you can help. And then also finally, there are also new restrictions on organizations like mine who are out doing voter registration. And so that's just another thing out there to be aware of. But it's not all bad. Marcus just says limits to drop boxes. Yes, that goes hand in hand with the making it harder to vote by mail, making it harder to drop off your ballot. And that may have changed. The place you dropped off your ballot in 2020 may well be different this year. So thank you, Marcus. Great flag. So I think, again, don't need to tell this group that voting matters, but some of the issues that we know are particularly important to the communities that we and you serve that are worth talking about. And it's fine to talk about these in a nonpartisan way while still making the point that these elections matter a lot. Just because there's not a president, a presidential candidate at the top of the ticket this year, there are huge, huge issues at play that will affect all of our lives. Clearly, the Supreme Court makeup for decades to come will in part be determined, by these elections. What's going to actually happen to our communities in terms of infrastructure? Redistricting, I've already talked about. The people who will be making redistricting decisions in 10 years. So for us, for our children, for your clients' children, are being elected right now, this year, most likely. Whether we actually act on climate before it's too late, of course. And then, of course, long-term decisions about working families, reproductive rights, as millennials reach middle age, what are Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid going to look like? Again, things that impact, the people that you're working with and advocating for every single day. In terms of who's on the ballot, I encourage you to check and find out for your own state. There's a number of great online resources for this, including our own website, which is vote411.org. The entire House of Representatives, a third of the Senate, 36 governors' races, and then, of course, hundreds of mayors, city councils, and school boards. And those local offices, I would argue, have even more of a say in things like local housing policy and school policy and policing budgets and things like that disproportionately impact the communities that you serve. So these are the people making decisions every day that have a huge influence on our lives. And it's important if you're talking about elections to help connect those dots for the people who may not have voted before or may not understand why it matters. And I have a few points here just to kind of help make that connection. As I said, the people in our state legislatures are deciding, who gets Medicaid access. They're deciding how immigrants, lives work, how immigrants are treated. In 2019, just as to underscore that point, there were 181 different laws passed at the state level that impacted the lives of immigrant families. So we tend to focus a lot on what's happening at the national level, but our state lawmakers and our local lawmakers are making huge decisions about our lives. Clearly, abortion rights is going to be, front and center going into these next elections, and specifically what states are going to do following what we assume the Supreme Court is going to do in its decision. And then certainly locally, as I've said, our local officials are having huge impact as well on the policies that impact really our day-to-day lives in a very, very personal way. You can find out what the people do on our Vote 411 site, which I'll show you a look at in a minute. We have a basic job description for what all of these offices do. So folks can actually go and read about what does my city manager do? What does my city council person, what are they generally responsible for? Because that isn't something that we all, are familiar with. Now, in terms of the issues that are top of voters' minds right now, I looked at a most recent Pew poll, I think just last week. And the three issues that were really at the top are economy, climate, education. Clearly, as the summer begins and goes on, I would expect that reproductive rights will also be at the top of this list. When we're talking about younger voters, things like climate and equality in particular continue to be at the very top of the list as well as racial issues, racial equality. So those are important issues to be talking about and framing voting in a way that you're talking about, those things. In terms of what we are doing as an organization, we set up a rapid response network for all 50 states plus DC going into big election years so that we can be on top of especially changes that are happening to voting that impact people's right to vote. We work with the media to quickly react to bad information. If there's misinformation out there about voting, we work to set the record straight, make sure that voters have the right information. We do direct voter contact into millions of households every year and are excited that we do a lot of that with partners at the community level. That may be something you can get involved in with the local league in your area. And I would definitely encourage you to do that. As I said, we work with thousands of partners to help get our good information out. So it's very likely that the League of Women Voters in your area may have lots of free printed materials, certainly online information, stickers, buttons, postcards, all that kind of stuff, driving people back to our most current up-to-date information about elections in your area, and that they would be thrilled to share that with you, thrilled to even come on site if you have an on-site, a facility, a housing complex, and actually provide voter registration or help with, answering voting questions. That's something that lots of our local advocates are doing, and we would, they would in many cases love to work with you if you don't already have a relationship. In terms of kind of at the national level, we've sent almost 300,000 letters to Congress and the Biden administration since July 2020, mostly on voting rights topics, but also on some topics like, like abortion rights and reproductive justice. And then we're doing other important things in Florida. If anyone's from Florida, just as an example, you may know that Florida voters overwhelmingly supported an amendment that would restore the right to vote to folks who had served time for a felony conviction. The state tried to then kind of undermine the people of Florida and make that process not work for people who had the right, who deserved to have their rights restored. The league in Florida contacted 80,000 people in that state to make sure they knew the basic facts about their right to register to vote, because the state administration was trying to make it more difficult for them. In the 2022 primaries just now, we wrapped up reaching over 500,000 voters in 7 key states where we are concerned about voter suppression happening this year. So that's just examples of the kind of work that we're doing and doing with partners as often as we can. I mentioned Vote411. .org. This is the site we've had for 15 years. We served 6 million voters through the site back in 2020. Based on our traffic so far for this year during the primaries, we think we're on track to probably beat that this year. This information is very sought after. We have an award-winning site that has nationwide candidate information. So every voter in America will be able to find full information about who and what is on their ballot. Things like I've already mentioned, polling place questions, how to get registered to vote, how to verify your voter registration, especially important if you're working with communities who move frequently, which I expect many of you are. So if people have moved since 2020 or even since last year, they may have to update their voter registration in order to be eligible to vote. That's a huge thing that we know millions of voters miss every year. We know a lot of people have been displaced as a result of COVID and other challenges. And so really want that to be a key message that we're getting out. And then all the other information that your folks may need to vote. So it's fully bilingual, the site, and we certainly encourage you to utilize it however is helpful. And again, many of our local leagues in the local areas are promoting that site as well and helping inform all the information that lives on it. Just an example of some of the litigation that we undertook and some of the work that we are doing on behalf of voters. These were things we did in 2020. There are a lot of similar efforts underway right now in Virginia. Thank you, Courtney. I see she just dropped the link into the chat. In Virginia, we successfully challenged a requirement that absentee ballots had to have 2 witness signatures or have a notary seal on it, which made it hard for people, especially during COVID, to be able to vote by mail. We successfully got rid of that through a lawsuit in 2020. Unfortunately, now it's back on the table. And so you do require a witness signature right now, again, in Virginia. So that's an example of how things have changed, right? So right there, that's something that is different about my own ballot. I'm a Virginia voter. In New Jersey, we successfully convinced the court to stop rejecting people's mail ballots if their signature didn't match. A lot of times a state is checking your signature on your ballot against maybe a signature you have on file with the DMV that could be 15 years old. Many of us have different looking signatures these days, right? Or they've evolved over time, right? So certainly we didn't want people's ballots to be rejected because of that. And we certainly didn't want their ballots to be rejected because the state had no good way of telling voters that that was happening. So that is a key thing that's happening. The more of us who vote by mail, the more some of these signature issues can get people in a snag. This, of course, significantly affects immigrant families, as do name matching issues. We see a higher, proportion of these issues coming up with Spanish speaking voters, for example. So something to be aware of. And again, to know what is the process in your state for checking your ballot, and where can you point people if they have questions about the status of their ballot? Has it been received by your local elections officials? Many states now have a way that you can check that, but not all of them do. And then in Pennsylvania, there was an issue about the drop boxes, which somebody mentioned earlier in the chat. And again, that's an issue that will continue to play out this year, as there are fights about how many drop boxes are enough in a community. So those are some of the things that, we'll be continuing to fight in court. At the same time, though, as I said, there's so much that we can do as nonprofits and as nonpartisan voices. We know that voters who are engaged by nonprofits turn out at higher rates, as much as 11%. That's according to Nonprofit Vote, which many of you, I'm guessing, are familiar with. They're an incredible organization who, among many other things, provide incredible hands-on training, as well as they run National Voter Registration Day, which I think many of you may be part of. So you are trusted. That's because you're trusted in your community. You're trusted by the people that you serve. They're going to listen to you when it comes to basic voting information and alerts about things that have changed. And so, you're crucial to building equity and access in our democracy, and you're reaching the people who are least likely to hear about voting from other mediums. So your voice is really important. And I just am so thrilled that so many of you are here to talk about this topic today. And finally, I have a few, best practices. These are 6 things, you could think about doing if you're not already. We know that in-person voter engagement really matters. As much as we can do so much online these days, that in-person connection continues to matter. There's a reason that door-to-door canvassing by political campaigns continues to be at the top of the list of activities. It's because it works. Door-to-door interfacing continues to be the most effective get out the vote tactic that we have. And so if you are directly serving communities, that's the time to be incorporating voter information. Many of you would want to do that on paper, in print, if you're serving communities who don't have great internet access, for example. And again, our local league might be able to help you with that and have things that are already printed, ready to go with the most up-to-date information. So please do check. There's an easy way to search for your local league at our homepage, which is lwv.org. You can search by zip code and find your local league to get connected. I'm also happy to help make connections. If you have trouble, you can always reach out to me, and our team will help you do that. It's important to reach out via email, via in person, if you're already communicating with residents, for example, or partners, and let them, again, focus on checking that registration status. You can start that kind of outreach now, right through September, and link to a service that you trust, or point them to a service that you trust, whether it's us or another nonprofit or your local elections official. As we've talked about, finding out about early and mail voting and how that is working this year, there's a chance it may still change in your area. So check again come October and make sure that you have the latest information about how that is. We usually go out of our way to put that as an alert on the page on Vote 411 for any state that has had a recent change. Again, it'll be in both English and Spanish, so it's something that you can grab and use if you'd like. As I mentioned before, encouraging folks who want to do something more to consider being a poll worker. That's a paid gig in many states. And the Power of the Polls effort is a great nonpartisan effort that is helping match people with poll worker opportunities around the country. And then whether it's your organization doing some advocacy work, or even if it's just you as an individual, contacting your lawmakers and telling them that you stand for voting rights. You want them to be advocates of voting rights and helping connect the dots, right, between housing justice issues and voting rights issues. Telling them that you're watching and paying attention is really important. And again, you all are respected advocates in your communities, and your voice on this can matter a whole lot. And then finally, I have just a couple final kind of get out the vote best practices. Reminding people to vote and reminding them 3 times is fine. In fact, it's preferred. And I know Joseph is going to probably touch on some of these same themes. Again, ask them to go ahead of time to either an elections official website, to our site, to another partner that you trust, and have a plan, right? Ask them to think through ahead of time what their plan is for election day. Are they planning to vote early? Are they planning to submit that mail-in ballot or go drop it off somewhere? Do they know where they need to go to vote? Do they know that they have the right ID in your state if that's required? And then keeping it brief and positive. I have focused a lot on the bleak situation out there in terms of voting rights. That's for your awareness. When we're talking to voters, especially first-time voters, the research really does tell us to be motivational and positive, and to say, we alone, the voters, can change the direction of our country, and we have to vote in order to do it. That is really the message to lead with. So I'll stop there and let Courtney and Kayla say if we have time for questions now or whatever you want to do.
Thank you so much, Maggie. We do have a question in the chat about accessibility. So Miranda asked, what provisions are there in states with restrictions on mail-in ballots for those who cannot sign the ballot for physical reasons?
So that totally depends on your state. I will say, and that's a great question, and of course important to a lot of the folks that you are serving. There are basic accessibility requirements outlined in federal law that affect voting, as well as state and local level ordinances. And then of course those things get implemented sometimes better than others. That's the reality. So I would definitely check with what the state and local rules say. Our Vote 411 page for every state will have accessibility issues. We work with the American Association of People with Disabilities to help inform that information. They have a great voting rights campaign as well called Rev Up that I'm involved with, and that helps do specific outreach to voters with disabilities. So that specific rule is different in different places. I know Kansas and somewhere else that I'm not remembering right now have specifically made it harder to get help with your ballot, if you're a voter with a disability, for example, and have made it harder for an organization like ours to help voters who may need that accessibility assistance. So that's another thing that we are fighting in court right now.
Thank you. Yeah, I know a lot of our members are also involved with Rev Up. That intersection of housing rights and disability rights is so important.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I am seeing some enthusiasm, of course, about the importance of renters turning out to vote and just why these resources are especially important in light of the impact of voter suppression on renters. So really, really appreciate this presentation. And I think I will pass it along to Joseph now.
Hi, I'm Joseph Battistelli. I'm the Director of Outreach and Membership for the Coalition on Human Needs. I will start by saying that I'm actually standing in for my very talented colleague, Dominique Espinoza, who's feeling a little bit under the weather. So this presentation probably won't be quite as well prepared as Maggie's wonderful presentation just was. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about CHN, going to tell you a little bit about what CHN's activities during this election season will be and the experience we have that we're drawing on. And then I'm going to spend the majority of my time on what you guys, being service providers, advocacy organizations, government administrators of programs, can be doing between now and November to help the clients, customers, and general public you serve make their impact felt at the polls and be able to access their right, as this is a democracy. So to start us off, the Coalition on Human Needs is a coalition of 100+ national organizations, unions, think tanks, religious organizations, service providers, and many, many more that come together to help advocate for the needs of low-income Americans and other people who are historically disadvantaged, such as veterans, single mothers, and others. Our work this election season is to basically make your job easier. And, our work is to try to find out ways that organizations that work with low-income communities can have, with as easy of a lift on their behalf, make the greatest amount of impact. We have done this before. We have worked during the 2020 decennial census with service providers and local organizations to make sure that people got counted. We are currently working across the country to make sure that everyone eligible gets the child tax credit that was expanded last year, and you can still get a lot of money, or your clients can still get a lot of money. And we last election cycle also did this same similar work. Last election cycle, as you see on the screen, we built up relationships with national groups and with local groups. We created resource libraries. We held webinars. We partnered with Vote Forward to allow activists and others who wanted to be engaged in a nonpartisan way reach out and make sure that people were aware of the information they needed to, got registered, knew where their polling place was and how to get there. We also did some fun stuff like coordinated rides to the polls and pizza to the polls, where people are actually able to feed people who had to wait long times in line. A little bit more on that last part in just a moment. If you go to the next one. Our current efforts are, we're currently still collecting materials, fact sheets, information, and we are trying to connect with partners and make new ones. That's all of you guys, that's why I'm here. We are listening to the needs of the people on the ground and trying to meet those needs as they come in. And we're, of course, again, partnering with Vote Forward so that activists can get engaged also. Next slide, please. Thank you. A little bit about what you guys can be doing. And a lot of this, I'm going to go quickly because Maggie did do a great job covering this under her presentation. Conduct and promote voter registration. Educate voters on the voting process, and that includes new laws. Help the public navigate those new laws and help organize rides to the polls. I want to be very clear about that last one. There is a big drop off of voters who register to vote, but then never make it to the polls. And closing that gap helps push that out. And then voter activation. When you have people excited to vote, they want to help out, make sure that other people are excited to vote. And you guys should always have an avenue to help encourage and encourage that activity and find ways that your clients and customers can take part in that. Next slide. The three basic things that we're trying to encourage across the country, if you do nothing else, is to help people register to vote, make sure they know about new laws, where their polling station is, and other education. Who's on the ballot is included in that. Without saying you vote for this person or don't vote for this one, don't be partisan about it, but they should still know who's on the ballot. And the last is the mobilization effort, making sure people actually return those ballots or go to the polls on election day. Next slide. Voter registration, the first of those three. People need to know their state voting laws. Those include your deadlines to register, the last day to register, where you can register remotely. Can you help your family register? Who can be involved in those efforts? Making sure that they know that their own voter registration status. Some people think that they registered to vote, but then they forgot that they moved, and so they've got to update that. There's actually a link in this slide which will be sent around. You can click on it and check your registration anywhere in the country. Making sure they know when their state deadline is, and then again, updating it. So next slide. Voter education. Organizations such as yours should educate their staff, should educate their allies, And so that when they interact with the people that they serve, when they interact with members of the community, they can know the W's, the where, what, when, why, and how of voting. There's a link here. Maggie also had great links about Vote 411 is a wonderful resource, for example, but where to get access to get all this information for your particular state and then your particular locality within those states. Some states are quite large and not all counties have the exact same systems. Just go back. Thank you, sorry. There are some special circumstances. In certain states, as an ex-offender, you can vote. In other states, you can't. Voting and being homeless, voting with a disability, that includes registering when you have and needing assistance to actually sign voter registration cards and stuff like that. All that information can be found with the links that we're going to be providing you. Voting for the military and people living out of the country also. Many of you, I'm sure, live near military bases and have forward deployed members of your community. Next slide. Next is voter mobilization. Make sure your community knows what they need to know to actually mobilize and actually get in their votes. This is stuff like knowing where polling station is, knowing do they have to go to their local one or can they go to any in their precinct, how to make a plan to get to voting, make sure that they have that plan, and actually have a day of election plan of action to get to the polls. Next slide, please. Maggie touched on this, but I want to be very, very clear on this. Service providers are the single biggest way that we can make sure low-income people are aware of their rights and exercise those rights to vote if they so choose. Service providers interact with this population more than any other. They're more informed and more trusted. Back in 2016, there was a research study that said that there was 34 million low-income voters who were eligible but did not vote. Since the change in voting laws, we're expecting that number to probably grow. And so you guys, as the service providers, as the ones that have contact with this community, are critical in this chain of activities to get them to vote. Next slide. Here's where we get to the fun stuff. National organizations, and I'm going to split the rest of the presentation into two sections. National organizations and other local organizations like you guys. National organizations such as League of Women Voters, CHN, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, FRAC, others, Mi Familia Vota, all of those, you guys should lean on us. Ask us for the resources, the materials, the knowledge, the research, the sticky questions that you guys don't have time to find out. We will find that out for you. We will do that research. We will supply you with those toolkits, with those resources, with those fact sheets. We should be who you lean on for all of that stuff. This should be made as easy as possible for local organizations. And so, like I said, lean on us, I beg of you. You can go to any of these sites for any of these organizations and find fact sheets. You can find webinars. You can find other resources. This is the stuff you can be asking them for, and this is not an exclusive list. If you guys come to CHN and ask for something that's not on this list, we might not have it immediately, but we will find it. Templates, flyers, social media toolkits, email templates, text messaging templates, fact sheets, webinars, trainings, one-pagers, pamphlets. I'm going to add other things. If you guys want meme graphics, if you guys want specific made stuff about the rules governing whether you can have a voter registration party in a food bank, call us. We'll find out. We'll let you know. If you guys want to know if you can pair up the LIHEAP registration interview with the voter registration, ask us. We'll find out. We'll let you know. If you guys have any questions, Lean on your national partners. We will find those answers for you. Next slide. Here's the important part. The stuff that we at the national level cannot do is form your other local level organization and those connections. A food bank partnering with a local community organization to put on an event or a training or a registration will maximize capacity, get access to the population that we want to make sure is voting, and will make it a lot easier on everyone else. We know that no one out there is going to be doing this full time, that almost all of you are adding this on to an incredibly busy plate of work that you guys are already doing that is already incredibly important, whether that's providing housing, food, access to government programs. So work together to lighten the load. Lean on the national organizations and work with other local organizations to make this easier on yourself. And if there's anything that we can be doing to help foster that, let us know. Other examples of organizations you guys can be pairing with on this are food banks, boys and girls clubs, homeless shelters, childcare centers, community action agencies. You can also be going out to local high school groups, to local college groups. As long as you maintain and you make clear that you are engaging in nonpartisan C3 voter education work, your possibilities are limitless. And I encourage you to be expansive. Look at churches, community groups, mosques, temples. Reach out to all of them. A lot of them have volunteer capacity and a lot of them would love to help with this. Next slide. These are some of the activities you guys can partner with. We have worked in the past with Vote Latino and Lyft to give rides to the poll. They would give promo codes. We're hoping that's going to happen again. And when that does, we're going to let you know. The problem is that it's only used by people who know about it. And so if you guys, as soon as we get confirmation, can start spreading the word, that's a huge one. Getting to the polls is a big problem for a lot of people. The next is create check-in groups with neighbors and encourage your clients and your customers to do this so that they make sure that everyone on their block is registered, their information's up to date, and that they have a plan to get to the polls or return their ballot. The next is to make sure and to check in on those people who we know do vote, want to vote, but it's not made easy for them. Work with local service providers, local elder home providing communities to check in on the elderly, on the disabled, on other people that don't get out of the house much, make sure that they have or have mobility issues, to make sure that they're getting the assistance they need. Next slide. I told you I was going to come back to this thing, and here we are. In 2020, we did this thing called Pizza to the Polls. It was this great thing that was set up, and we helped fundraise to get pizzas delivered to people who are having to wait for hours in line to vote. Since then, there has been some legislation passed in some areas restricting the ability to do this. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other things you can do to support people in the who are going to the polls. You can make sure that people are aware of the weather, bring an umbrella, bring extra water. You can have them provide their own checklist for when they go to the polls. You can host voter registration drives in the next few months. There's a lot of current activities and there's a lot of prep work for future activities that you guys can be doing. I encourage you to get involved. And again, please lean on your national partners to get the resources and guidance, toolkits, and other materials that you need to make this as easy as possible on yourselves. Next slide. Host a phone bank and find volunteers to become poll workers. So the U.S. Election Assistance Commission is a national entity that helps staff polling places across the country. Polling in elections are done at a state level, but there is some national resources and coordination with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. I encourage you, if you have the capacity, if you have access to a large group of volunteers or people who might want to volunteer, check them out. Next slide. These are some resources of places you can get nonpartisan ballot information. A lot of people go to the polls, and I'm guilty of this myself, and they don't know everyone who's going to be on that ballot. They might know their senators, they might know their representatives, they definitely probably know if the president's on the ballot, and he won't be this time, but they might not know the local city council, the local school board. And those elections matter to people, and you can help your customers and clients be informed. See in the chat, someone says Project Vote Smart also has a good tool too. So there's another one. Next slide. These are the things that between now and election day, you're going to want to start trying to incorporate into your daily contact with your customers and clients. The election times and registration deadlines, that social media is going to be a big part of this. This is more for your staff, but also for your customers and clients. That this outreach needs to be at a low English proficiency level. Chances are that you work with communities that don't all speak perfect English, and perfect is a very subjective term that I won't get into. I encourage you to ask your national partners for resources in multiple languages. I also encourage you that when you make up your own materials and when you're communicating to your clients about this stuff, and it can be kind of technical, to try to keep the way you talk about it to a 5th grade level approximately. That's what I have, and we have a lot of talent on the line. And so if you have questions, comments, concerns, ask them now, reach out later. We're here till November.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Really, really incredible presentation and so many concrete ways to get involved. And thank you as well to Dominique for all of your work on this too. We got one question in the Q&A about Vote Forward and just your perspective on its impact on voter turnout. Is there any kind of indication of how that has gone?
Yes, actually, Vote Forward, and let me just do a little background so people understand what it is. Vote Forward is where they're either using snail mail, old-fashioned, put a postage stamp on it, or electronic mail. People who are really excited about voting reach out to people who historically have not voted a lot or haven't voted in the last few elections and urge them as a fellow member of the community, it means a lot, please go vote. We know that this works. People who receive this are much more likely than people who don't receive any of this communication to go vote. It's helpful to hear from a fellow member of your community, even if that community is the full state or even a state away, that it matters that people vote. They're not being told who to vote for with the work that we're doing. They're being told that the voting itself matters, that our democracy is participatory.
Yeah, I'll just echo that and say we didn't work with Vote Forward, but we, as I mentioned, I think we do a lot of this on our own and with partners, and specifically the mail continues to show at the top of the research in terms of effective get out the vote tactics. So as much as there is a lot of energy and enthusiasm around things like text banking voters, nothing against that. Maybe research will show at some point that that is an effective get out the vote tactic. The things that actually show an increase in turnout are things like contacting people in the mail, as I mentioned, knocking on doors, and to some extent live phone calls as well, at least as of a couple of years ago. Not robocalls, but a live phone call of a person calling and saying it's important, to me, similar to what Joseph said, to me as a neighbor in your community that you vote. So definitely postcarding opportunities. They're also something that people can really feel like they're doing something tangible and helpful, which is why it was such, I think, a popular thing done during COVID, because people felt like they could really do something and feel safe about it. And as we know, that's continuing to be at the top of a lot of volunteers' minds, even as we enter, the second summer with COVID in our lives. So 100%.
Thank you. And we got another question kind of related to keeping things nonpartisan. If you are registering clients or residents and they ask what party they should register with, do you have any tips on how to respond to that while keeping things nonpartisan?
So we generally, we would not direct people ever which party they should register. We do try to make sure that folks understand, and this is why, as Joseph said, partnering with an experienced group might be really helpful, whether it's one of our chapters or another civic group locally who can physically be there with you on hand, because they're used to answering questions like this all the time and probably have a really kind of a go-to script. We do try to make sure that folks understand that how they register for a party, or if they register for a party, depending on how that works in your state, can impact whether they're able to vote in primary elections. So in some states, if you don't register with a party, you won't be able to participate in primaries, which, some of that may be starting to wind down over the summer for you, but certainly would be something that your voters would care about going into the next presidential, which is going to come up really quickly here. So we usually say, we encourage you to go read about the candidates on one of the great websites, that we've talked about here today. Read the local news coverage of the candidates and decide for yourself if there's a party that you want to register for, or talk to your friends and family about that.
Thank you. And another question, I think Joseph alluded to this a bit, but is it okay to provide food and water at voter registration drives?
I want to be very clear. Laws are changing very quickly right now. And so I'm going to start the answer by saying that you need to check with your local area. But I also want to draw a big distinction. Providing food and water voter registration is something that I have not yet heard any restrictions being put on. Providing food and water at people waiting in line to cast their vote on election day or at early polling station is something that in certain locations has been restricted.
Yeah, and specifically Georgia is one that did restrict that. And yeah, again, big distinction totally between voting and a registration drive. A registration drive, generally there's no restriction on that piece. It's a great idea. You certainly can see higher traffic to a registration table if you're providing food and candy. However, it is important, and something we always encourage our folks to do is make sure that they're not providing any sort of one-to-one incentive for registering to vote or taking some other action and receiving that, that benefit. So you would make the pizza available to anyone who walked up to your table, right? Or the swag you're giving out, or whatever the case is, whether or not they actually fill out a voter registration application, because there are some state laws that you may run into in regards to that. So again, all the more reason to work with an experienced group who's going to feel really confident that they're doing things by the letter of the law, and that you're just, a supportive partner and not having to figure all that out for yourselves.
Thank you. And yeah, I see Victoria saying that that's something that they have run into in Florida, and providing that food and water to everyone, not just people who register. I see John, you've been raising your hand. I can invite you to speak. Oh, okay, 1 second. Let's see. John, did you want to ask a question? If not, that's okay. Feel free to put that in the chat. So I'm just gonna really quickly, we have about 2 minutes left. We can go ahead to some of the slides that I have on ways to continue getting involved. So you may be feeling pretty fired up right now on all of these actions going on, and may feel like, okay, what's the next role? What's the role for me? So one thing that you can do to get more involved beyond attending the webinars is to become an Our Homes, Our Votes affiliate. You are officially identified with the campaign. You commit to doing nonpartisan voter engagement work, whatever that may look like for you. You can be featured in our newsletter. You can get some of our campaign swag, co-brand logos and images. So we have a sign up form to be an affiliate, and I will be getting in touch with everyone who signs up in the next few weeks. Another opportunity on the next slide, we have something called the Housing Providers Council. So if you work with a housing provider, you're invited to join this. We brought together dozens of the largest providers of affordable housing in 2020 and are beginning to reconvene that group again. So if that applies to you, or if you work with housing providers in your network, please reach out to ourhomes@nlihc.org or reach out to me directly. We'll get you connected with that kickoff meeting. And next up, also wanted to plug the civic holidays. I think one of our panelists mentioned National Voter Registration Day. There's also National Voter Education Week, Vote Early Day, Election Hero Day, and we are partners. NLIHC is partnering on these civic holidays, and local and state organizations are invited and encouraged to partner as well. So I'll put that sign up form in the chat as well. And then lastly, we have next week, we'll have not an Our Homes, Our Votes call. We'll have a bi-weekly Housed National call. And our next Our Homes, Our Votes call will be 2 weeks from tomorrow, because there is Memorial Day on a Monday. So we'll be switching to Tuesday. And here we go. We also have our social media handles. Make sure you're following the campaign on all our platforms to keep up with the latest. So that's all our announcements. I did see a question that came in about reaching out to voters who are in subsidized housing but live independently. And that's something that we'll be talking about through the Housing Providers Council. So we're definitely paying attention to that and working to engage those voters. So I think that covers everything. Thank you so much to our panelists. Yes, you are absolutely welcome to share these recordings far and wide. Our goal is to get the word out about all the incredible work that our partners are doing and all of the ways to get involved. So really appreciate all of you being here.